at the 8 o'clock. Well, today we have another story about a scribe, a leader, coming to ask Jesus a question. So this is the same level of other stories, but it's actually quite different than a lot of these other stories, because it doesn't say that the scribe was testing Jesus. That's the first difference. And the main difference is that the scribe and Jesus actually agree upon the answer to the question. That's pretty big. So not everybody was against Jesus. Not even the majority of people were against him, actually. Most people probably just said, okay, sure. There were many different offshoots of Judaism in Jesus' time, not unlike today, and not unlike our different Christian denominations. So more often than not, people probably did agree with Jesus. It was just the people in power didn't. Now, I'm always railing you guys with context within the story, but now I'm going to give you some context about the actual text, because nothing is written in a vacuum. For example, if you were going to write a biography about JFK now, in 2018, it will be very different than if you had written it in 1970, because the culture and experience, the history, and even the personality of the author and the eyes of the reader are different. And all of that affects the actual text and then how the story is interpreted. Even fact-based texts have a certain slant to them based upon where and by whom they are written. So, the Gospel of Mark was written around 70 CE, which is the common era. That's what we say now instead of AD. So 70 CE, which was a little while after Jesus' death, right? Mark's Gospel is thought to be the oldest one that we have, written first. So a lot of scholars conclude that the other Gospels were based upon Mark's Gospel and then expanded out, fleshed out a bit. Now, at this point in history, in 70 CE, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome, and it's still gone. And this was very devastating to the Jewish people, because the temple was the center of their lives. It was the center of worship, and it was where God resides. So how could they properly worship without the temple? That was a big question. So Mark's audience for this text were Jewish people who were longing for their temple, but they were also Jews who followed Jesus, which set them apart from the mainstream. But Mark's audience also included Gentile people who followed Jesus, and they were not required to convert to Judaism. So this was a complicated community. They were all together trying to figure out how they were going to get along and how they're going to worship and exist in this new community. And a lot of the other Jewish groups didn't necessarily like this new mixed community and would give them a hard time and sometimes accuse them of not being real Jews. And we still hear stuff like this today within our own Christian denominations, right? So it was a very difficult time. There were lots of growing pains and lots of questions. So when Gospel of Mark was written, this tension and these questions were in the author's mind. So those themes come out in the text. They carry into the stories. So today's story addresses the question of which commandment is the greatest. And yes, the commandments have rank. They always have. Some are greater than others. The underlying idea here, according to Ron Allen, is not necessarily which commandment is greatest, but the question is, what is essential to Jewish identity? What is the one thing that's going to set us apart? when we literally cannot go to the temple and sacrifice because the temple is gone, how are we going to still be faithful to God and our worship? So today, Jesus says, sacrifices are good and holy. They're still good and holy. He says that you don't have to stop doing that. But the main things to remember are to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds simple, but it's not, right? And Jesus and the scribe agree, which is a great thing, and it's very rare in the gospel. The law and the Old Testament sometimes get a bad rap from us Christian preachers. The few Pharisees and Sadducees in the gospel who are against Jesus make us sometimes think that everybody was legalistic and unforgiving about the law. But that really wasn't true. It always has been more important to honor the spirit of the law than to uphold the exact letter of the law, because a lot of times you can't. And as long as you did your best in love, you were fine in the eyes of the majority of the leaders. And that's what Mark is getting at to tell his community in strife. Ron Allen continues, Mark makes the theological judgment that while the temple and sacrifice may have played an important role in Judaism in an earlier era, those things are not essential to Jewish identity. With the temple destroyed, the community can no longer participate in burnt offerings and sacrifice. The congregation can still be authentically Jewish by practicing the monotheism of the God of Israel and by loving neighbors. So this mixed congregation can get together and worship and be a community unified. The Jewish folks without the temple and the Gentile folks without full conversion to Judaism. They can be a faithful, worshiping community, no matter what other people think of them. And this is all about loving neighbors. Not romantic love. It's more like our baptismal covenant, where we promise to strive for justice and peace and respect the dignity of every human being. Thinking about the good of the whole group instead of just what's best for me. That's the key to Christianity and all different religions as well, usually. I probably sound like a broken record, especially since my whole sermon last week was about this too. Next time I'll look ahead. But I do sound like a broken record because we need to keep hearing it, right? Love God, love your neighbor, all your neighbors. This story is a story about agreement across difference, which is something that is very important for us in our world today. We cannot let fear and prejudice and hate ruin the world and make us hate each other for no reason. Some of you probably know I go to the House of Corrections here in town and do Bible study. And we were talking about that story where Jesus says, before you point out the speck of dust in your neighbor's eye, you should probably take care of that huge log that's in your eye. Yeah. And it came down to loving our neighbors, which is what all the stories do in the end. And one gentleman shared a story. He said that after September 11th, he got wrapped up into that all anti-Muslim rhetoric, right? And he hated all Muslims. But recently, during his incarceration, he was thinking, and he heard God tell him in a little small voice to think it over, do some research, do some study, and, maybe you can change your mind. So he started reading up on the Quran, and he started talking to his Muslim bunkmates and even the imam who comes to the prison, who's a really great guy, I have to say. And he discovered that, Christians and Muslims have way more in common than a lot of the hate mongers of the world would have you think. We are neighbors, and we all have commandments from God to love each other, all of us. And we all have to learn to work together to make the world a better place. That is how we honor God. By loving our neighbors, we are completing the first part, loving God. So in order to change our perspective on things, we need to change from the selfish idea of, I'm going to do what's best for me, to the loving idea of, I want to do what's best for us and what's best for the whole world, which is always to find common ground and have agreement across difference, like in the story today, and always loving our neighbors, and in that way honoring God and Christ. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.